In December of 1903, two bicycle mechanics from Ohio, brothers Orville and Wilbur Wright, coaxed a fragile craft into the air at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Their machine was little more than canvas stretched across spruce wood, held together with wire, a gasoline engine, and a pair of propellers carved by hand. The flight lasted just 12 seconds and covered 120 feet, shorter than the wingspan of a modern 747. But it was enough. For the first time in human history, a powered, heavier-than-air machine lifted from the earth, stayed aloft, and landed under control. In the immediate years that followed, aviation became a national fascination. Newspapers filled their pages with tales of daring flights. The question on everyone's mind was simple. How far can a plane travel? Can it cross a city, a state? What about an entire continent? In 1911, a powerful news publisher named William Randolph Hearst offered a prize of $50,000 to the first aviator who could complete a transcontinental flight in under 30 days. 8 pilots tried. Only one came close. His name was Cal Rodgers, a towering 6'4" aviator, partially deaf, always with a cigar in his teeth. He had only learned to fly a few months earlier, yet piloting came naturally. Rodgers bought a Model EX from the Wright brothers and set out to win the prize. He decided to follow the railroad, accompanied by a 3-car support train with mechanics, spare parts, reporters, and even his family. If he broke down, they would fix the plane in real time and get right back up in the air. He named his airplane the Vin Fiz Flyer, after the great drink that sponsored his quest. That fall, Rodgers set out from Brooklyn, New York, in front of several hundred spectators. People cheered and waved hats as the Vin Fiz Flyer rattled down the field and lifted up from the ground. On October 18th, 114 years ago to the day, Rodgers landed in Waco, Texas. The next day, he took off heading south. By the time he reached Austin, 3,000 people had traveled by streetcar and then walked a mile to where Rodgers would land. This is the picture of the scene in Austin. When the train pulled up, agents hopped out and showered the spectators with advertisements as if it was confetti. They had all kinds of souvenirs to sell, including postcards and specialty stamps. Folks were told that Rodgers would carry those postcards in his pocket and mail them at his next landing. In other words, this was the first airmail postal delivery service in human history. 1 hour after touching down in Austin, Rodgers took off again. He circled the new Capitol Dome, it was 20 years old, waved at the crowd below, and turned south towards San Antonio. And because he followed the railroad, everyone in Kyle knew exactly what that meant. He would be flying directly overhead. Now keep in mind, no one in Kyle had ever seen a plane. No plane had ever flown over Hays County. No plane had ever landed in Hays County. You may wonder, what was Kyle like in 1911? Would you like to see? Did anyone go to Founders Day last Saturday and watch the parade down Center Street? Here is an image of the same parade on the same route in 1911. You will notice that Old City Hall, which is now the Krug Activity Center, named after Mayor Pete Krug, is missing from this photo. It should be on the right side, but Old City Hall was not constructed until the following year, which you can see in this picture from the parade just a year or two later. Business in Kyle was booming in 1911. At the back of this picture, you can see the train depot, which was the economic engine to the city of Kyle. To the right of the depot, you can see a 2-story hotel where travelers would stay when they got off the train. Kyle actually had multiple downtown hotels in 1911. Here's a view of the train depot from the south. You can see how they used the land around the tracks for staging of goods to be loaded and unloaded on the train. Unfortunately, the trains at that time produced lots of sparks when they stopped, and the Kyle Depot in this image would burn to the ground in 1916. It would be replaced by the depot that now serves as a museum next to City Hall. Here's a picture of the train depot's platform in 1911. Notice the way the folks are dressed who traveled by train. Very chic, I think. If you stood on that platform and looked west down Center Street, this is what you would see. Modern day City Hall would be on the right. Further down, the Sledge Mercantile store is on the right. Here's what that store looked like on the inside. Notice the types of dry goods they sold. Don't you want to walk in there and buy something? Here's the Kyle Creamery. It was located next to the D.A. Young building, which is pictured here. This building was constructed in 1881 and is the oldest structure still standing in Kyle today. Give me a cheer if you've ever seen or been to the D.A. Young building. Here's the H.C. Wallace Lumber Company. That's Mr. Wallace on the porch. His daughter-in-law, Laura Bell Wallace, would teach students in the community for more than 50 years and is the namesake for Wallace Middle School. Here's Teely's Meat Market. Their meat was cooled with 1,200-pound blocks of ice that had to be hauled in from San Marcos twice a week. Can you believe that? Now, one of the biggest businesses in the early days was Kyle's Cotton Gin, located just east of the tracks. The function of the gin was to separate the cotton from the seeds and the debris. And that clean cotton, does anybody know what it was called? Lint. Here's a picture of the Tompkins Company that sold groceries and dry goods. It was located where the modern-day Hayes Free Press now stands. The owner, J.W. Tompkins, was Kyle's first mayor. Here's a picture of high schoolers in 1911. They went to Kyle School. Notice how they're dressed as they walk through that field. Today, it's a struggle to get my kids to wear anything other than Crocs and gym shorts. Kids, imagine dressing like this for school, and imagine that one of your classes is learning how to hoe a field. This is the brand new Kyle High School under construction in September 1911. It was located right next to modern-day Kyle Elementary. All right, now that we have our bearings in Kyle in 1911, let's pick up our story on Cal Rodgers as he heads south towards San Antonio. Kyle's superintendent, Sam Eaton, told the students that morning that a gong would ring as the Vin Fiz approached. When that happened, everyone was to march outside in a single file line and watch the plane from the school property. The students were excited, as you can imagine. On the square downtown, residents started gathering to watch the event as the time approached. And then it happened. On the ranch at the north end of town, Mrs. Bunton was the first to see the Vin Fiz and hear its engine. Immediately, she rang the bell to alert the community. But then she noticed something was wrong. If you folks will look out to the east, right over there where ACC is, imagine just above that, the first plane ever coming through the city of Kyle. And the story I'm about to tell you happened right over there. Rodgers was at 3,500 feet, going 60 miles an hour when, according to him, one of his intake valves blew out, and the head dropped down and broke a hole in the piston. In other words, His engine completely broke apart, and the violence caused the Vin Fiz to tumble into an uncontrollable dive. His engine dead, Rodgers held on to the elevator and warping levers with everything he had as he tried to slow his dive. He was over a wooded area, he said. Then he said there was no place to land that wouldn't decimate the biplane and him along with it. Then he noticed that just to the south was the small town of Kyle with a few fields that looked good for landing. Using the levers, he willed the plane level as the ground rushed up at him, narrowly missing the roofs of several homes and touched down. It's a true story. At the school, no sooner had the students heard the gong and looked out the window, it was immediately noticed that the plane was coming down. So do you think they went out in single file line? What was supposed to have been a well-organized march from the building turned into a riot and a mob. Pupils slid down the stairs, jumped out the windows, ran through the doors, and were on their way as fast as they could in the direction of the grounded Aviator. The students, of course, were not alone. Folks downtown also saw what happened. Immediately, they jumped on their horses and buggies and tore out. Burleson Road was soon a mass of horses, a couple of cars, and hundreds of human beings, all in a dead sprint. Mrs. Bunton and her group were the first to arrive at the crash site. She later wrote that Rodgers was so dazed, she could hardly get any sense out of him. He was terribly frightened, she wrote. Cal finally found the words, and he told her simply that he had just made a narrow escape. According to reporters who traveled with him, even though he had crash landed before, this was the closest Rodgers had come to perishing on the journey. This is the image of the Vin Fiz in Kyle, Texas, the first time any airplane touched Earth in Hays County. 2 days later, on the morning of October 21st, with the sun shining and a crowd of Kyle residents surrounding his plane, Rodgers once again ascending. For 20 minutes, he flew circles around Kyle. They say he did it to give the train time to get out ahead, but it didn't matter to Kyle residents. They stood there watching a plane fly around longer in the air than nearly anyone in the world ever had up to that point. 6 weeks after he left Kyle, Rodgers touched down in Pasadena, California, completing his 4,000-mile transcontinental journey. He missed a $50,000 prize by a wide margin, but his daring journey made him the first man to complete a coast-to-coast flight in human history. The Vin Fiz Flyer now hangs in the Smithsonian, and the name Cal Rodgers now holds its place in the record books. All right, as you can tell, thank you. Since I've researched this story, I have been captivated by what I learned. I think about those kids and how, after what they had just witnessed, they must have had the most amazing conversations about what the future held in store. Who among them could have imagined that just over 50 years later, not only would we be flying commercially all over the world, but Americans would be walking on the moon? Another thought I kept having was this. Imagine if I could snap my fingers and transport those students on the day after Rodgers left directly to this podium. Can you even imagine how they would feel if they saw this town now? Do you think they would feel sorry for us if I told them how long the drive is from our air-conditioned house to our air-conditioned work and our air-conditioned car? Do you think they would feel sorry for me if I pulled out the supercomputer in my pocket and showed them something negative someone wrote about me on Facebook? I seriously doubt it. At any rate, those children were not magically transported from that moment to this. They walked through life one hard day at a time. Case in point, 3 years after the Vin Fiz landed in Kyle, America plunged into its first World War.